Ito is completely one of the masters. I think that what he has is that he is. I like people that get high on their own supply. I get high on my own supply. I'm like Scarface at the end. You know, I grab my movies and I go, oh, you know, I don't have an objective distance. I am not postmodern. I just go phase in, you know. And I think Ito is the same way. Like in the way that you feel Dario Argento in the early movies was getting off on each murder, or you feel David Cronenberg sort of secretly being aroused by body horror, you know? In the same way you feel Junji Ito being titillated at a very basic, disturbing level by his stuff.
Japanese manga author Junji Ito is often compared to deceased horror legend and man who named his cat after a racial slur, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. And it's not hard to see why. Not because of the cat thing, but because many of Ito's and Lovecraft's stories are part of a literary genre commonly referred to as Lovecraftian or cosmic horror, which can be summarized by Lovecraft's perhaps most famous quote: "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." How and why the things in Ito's and Lovecraft stories happen, and why they happen to the specific people in the stories, is rarely explained. And the point is that it doesn't really matter. The protagonists are so small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things that they will never be able to fully understand the situations they've stumbled upon. And even if they try, they will still be powerless to do anything about them. The universe is indifferent. It's not good or evil. But it is terrifying, in every sense of the word. Ito and Lovecraft stories do share some similar themes, but are, in a way, polar opposites of each other. Lovecraft often tried to describe the impossible, otherworldly horrors the human mind simply cannot comprehend. Things like elder gods who will drive you mad if you as much as take a peek at them, or unimaginable sentient colors from outer space not even Nicolas Cage can save us from. It's easy to find illustrations of Lovecraft's creations, like the fish gods Dagon, or Cthulhu, the most famous one. But if Lovecraft himself could barely describe these otherworldly things with words, how could anyone really illustrate them? I mean, you obviously don't go mad from doing a Google image search for a picture of a Shoggoth, right? If Lovecraft would have tried to depict these creatures visually, he would have disproven their impossibility. It is you, as the reader, who is supposed to try to imagine these horrible things in your own head. Try being the key word, because whatever you come up with will probably be a lot scarier to you personally than whatever Lovecraft could have shown you. It can be really thought-provoking and unnerving to, for example, try to visualize a completely new color that no one has ever seen before. I mean, what else can't I see? Is reality really the way I perceive it? Does objective reality truly exist, and who or what has access to it? Will we ever experience it, and what happens if we do? Oh god, I think I'm spiraling! And speaking of spirals, Junji Ito never really needs to describe much of anything in his stories, because contrary to Lovecraft, he makes you look at every painstakingly drawn detail of his creations. In Shiver, one of his short story collections, there are author's notes, and this might be because he didn't have much space to write, or because he doesn't like talking about the subtext of his stories that much. But these notes are mostly just about how Ito came up with the idea for a scene or a monster. I get the feeling that at least some of his stories were written with a very routine mindset. I read a fashion magazine once, and one of the models gave me a strange feeling, so I made a story about a scary fashion model. Stuff like that. I'm not saying Ito's literary work lacks depth, because that wouldn't be true. But I think Ito looks at his ideas less in the way Lovecraft looked at his, and more in the, non-dramatic way Marge Simpson looks at potatoes.
I just think they're neat.
He seems more fascinated than scared by horror.
Have you ever drawn something that was so scary or so disturbing that you were like, no, this is too much. I can't show anybody this drawing. It's too scary even for me.
いやー、そんなものが描けたら本当にいいんですけどね。
Yeah, if I could draw something like that, that would be great.
His stories aren't very focused on characters or plot, they're driven by visual spectacle. I think he cares more about your reaction to what is going on than the reaction of his protagonists. Because they are almost interchangeable. They are vehicles in which you get to travel through his stories and see the sights he wants to show you. And those sights can sometimes be so horrifying and gross that it feels uncomfortable just having your fingers rest on certain pages. Ah, fuck! Soap will heal my trauma! Seriously though, wash your hands, it's really important. Both Ito's and Lovecraft's work suffer from a similar problem though. They have, historically, been very hard to adapt to any other kind of media. One would think that adapting the works of Ito would perhaps be the easier task, since his manga panels are basically storyboards. And there have been several film adaptations of his stories made in Japan, but... I'm not gonna pretend that I am any sort of expert on Junji Ito adaptations, since I've only seen the live-action Uzumaki film, some episodes of the Junji Ito collection anime, and bits and pieces of some other stuff. But I feel like most of these adaptations, if not all of them, lack what made the original panels so unnerving in the first place. Remember when you were a kid and you used to go to the video store to rent films? Remember how scared you got by just walking through the horror section and seeing one of the VHS or DVD covers? And how less scary that film turned out to be when you eventually watched it years later? That's essentially what it feels like to go from reading Junji Ito to watching Junji Ito. Seriously, I still get scared shitless from that goddamn Goosebumps cover with the fucking mask! I'm not gonna claim that you can't make a good film or series adaptation out of Ito's work, but it is apparent that it's very hard, or maybe even impossible, to make something that even comes close to Ito's work with the budgetary and or time-related constraints the people behind these adaptations had. All those little details, the shadows drawn with individual pencil strokes, the wrinkles, the textures, they're all gone. Even in the Junji Ito collection, where some frames have been taken directly from the source material, they look way worse. Like, look at this panel from Shiver. You can clearly see that it's windy outside. There are a lot of dramatic shadows all around Hideo's face and clothes that really intensifies the image. And the holes all over his body look like they have some actual three-dimensional depth. Now look at the same scene in the anime adaptation. The background is just a grey void. There are barely any dark shadows at all, and all of the holes look like flat spots. But at least the Junji Ito collection kinda looks like the source material. The live-action stuff, on the other hand, just doesn't work at all. Uzumaki is at least a little bit entertaining as a standalone horror film, but it pales so much when compared to the manga. Take the scene where we see Toshio Saito's corpse. In the film, the scene looks like this. There are two changes here that drastically alter the impact of the scene. First of all, the details are once again gone. What actually looked like a body being bent and stretched into a spiral pattern in the manga, where you can clearly see everything from hands to feet, now looks more like a head that has been placed in the middle of a big cinnamon bun. Delicious. Second of all, in the manga, it's Toshio's son and wife who finds the body, and Kirie, who is in the film version of the scene, only hears about it afterwards. And the panel where his body is shown has no speech bubbles, no commentary, and most importantly, no screaming. This change matters because, again, it's not the reactions of the characters that really matter. It's your reaction. Having Kirie scream in this scene feels like when a sitcom uses a laugh track. You're being told by the film that this is a spoopy scene. But when you're reading the manga, you're not being told to scream. You're being told to look. And no matter how gross the image is, Ito wants you to look closely. In the film, however, you don't get enough time for that. And even if you did, there isn't as much to see anyway. The reason why Ito's panels are so horrifying is very much related to why they are so chock full of details. It's because of their stillness. The images only disappear when you can't stand them anymore, or when you feel like you've looked at them long enough and want to start reading the next page. And since it's not multiple moving frames, Ito actually has some extra time to put in all that extra work on fewer images. I said before that I cannot claim that you can't make a good film or series adaptation out of Junji Ito's work, and I stand by that. However, I can claim that there is at least one video game that has managed to do it right. Yeah, I'm finally gonna start talking about World of Horror. I'm sorry it took me like
12 minutes
to get here. World of Horror is an early access game that was released in February 2020, and it's very clearly based on both Ito and Lovecraft. I may not be a legal expert, but I'd even say that some things in World of Horror are kinda legally questionable from a copyright standpoint. Like, that's Junji Ito. Junji Ito is in this game. And The Rock, for some reason? The developer even ripped off Junji Ito's dentist education, for God's sake! Joking aside, it's obvious that Pavel Kosminski is a huge fan of Ito, and not just some jerk who's trying to make you think he came up with all of this stuff on his own. It even says in the game description on Steam that the game is intended to be a love letter to Junji Ito and H.P. Lovecraft, and it's a damn good one. The game plays like something kinda similar to the board game Arkham Horror. You pick a character and you go to various locations in a small seaside town and try to solve mysteries and fight twisted creatures before a doom meter's filled up and an elder god comes down and fucks everything up. If you die during a playthrough, you have to start all over from the beginning. Although a complete playthrough might last about an hour, so it's not the worst punishment. It's very much Ito in the way that you're being taken along through a number of shorter horror stories about high school kid protagonists, and it's very much Lovecraft in that it challenges how many of these stories your protagonists can take before they go insane and or perish. There was this user review on Steam that has been updated since I found it, but the original review brought up some very interesting points about the game that I want to show you.
There is a fine line between difficulty and just based on RNG, where my choices stop having actual meaning because an event is going to harm me regardless of the correct decision. You are penalized literally every step of the way, no matter what you do, no matter how you try to play. If you play it safe, you get worse versions of endings, but if you play it unsafe, you are punished even further and given little in the ways of compensation for that risk. Make no mistake, you are going to die. Plenty. And most of the time, it isn't going to be because you did something wrong, but that the game decided you needed to die. And that is pretty scary.
And they were right. That is pretty scary. This might be because I've been playing a lot of Pathologic and have learned to enjoy punishing myself, but the reasons this Steam user didn't like World of Horror at first is kind of why I think the game is brilliant. Or at least that it could be brilliant when it's finished. It's pure cosmic horror, not just the mysteries, but the gameplay as well. The game is constantly working against you. You rapidly lose both sanity and health, even outside of battles, and you need both to stay alive. In one playthrough, you might be lucky and get a certain perk that gives you a chance to get better outcomes in certain randomly generated events. In another, you might be absolutely fucked from the start. Or right at the end, which happened to me once because I ran into an enemy at the lighthouse who raised the doom level with every attack, and I was already close to a 90%! After multiple playthroughs, you will probably know how many of the stories can end. But just because you know how to solve them doesn't mean that you always can, because you will never be in full control. It's like I said before, the protagonists are so small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things that they will never be able to fully understand the situations they've stumbled upon. And even if they try, they will still be powerless to do anything about them. But you're not completely powerless in World of Horror. You can still fight, and you can ultimately save the day, if you're lucky. It's kinda like you, the player, are the real reason why this town is going to hell. Sure, you are trying to save the town, but the reason the town needs saving in the first place is because you started the game and picked an elder god of your own choice to battle against. Hey, that almost sounds like... The graphical details in the game are clearly not on par with Ito's work, but it's not just how the images look that matters, but how it feels to look at them. Stylistically, the creatures look very much like they belong in Junji Ito stories. Hell, some of them already are in Junji Ito stories. And since most in-game events are portrayed with almost completely still images, which you click through kinda like you would turn a page, it all feels like it should. I most of all love these black introductive screens that precede all of the fights in the game. They really give you that experience of turning the page and BAM! New nightmare friend! The graphical limitations that come with this 1 and 2-bit aesthetic doesn't feel like a sacrifice. It feels like a deliberate choice. In an article by PC Gamer called Inside the Next Indie Frontier PS1-style horror games, developer Vincent Adinolfi, is that how you pronounce that? Sorry if I'm butchering your last name, had this to say about the haunted PS1 demo disc.
Someone commented on a video of the demo disc and said, "The gaps in detail create space for our brains to speculate wildly, fearfully. Abstraction works because we aren't given answers. And I don't think I could have possibly said it better myself."
I couldn't say it better either, so I got someone else to quote someone quoting someone else. Good times! Of course, this quote refers specifically to the haunted PS1 demo disc and horror games with an early PlayStation low polygon aesthetic, but I think it also describes why the aesthetic in World of Horror works so well. The game doesn't necessarily look worse than Junji Ito's artwork, it just looks a bit more abstract, which creates more space for our brains to speculate, like Vincent says. The style achieves a similar effect, but with a different method. What makes the game's graphics even more impressive is that they were all made in Microsoft Paint. I mean, it's impressive to me at least. I can barely make a decent stick figure with this thing. And as you've probably noticed by now, you can also change the game's color scheme. So you too can experience the eye-melting sensation of playing on a Virtual Boy. Seriously, it really hurt my eyes to record this. The icing on the cake that is World of Horror, though, is something that's synonymous with neither Ito or Lovecraft. And that's music. The soundtrack in World of Horror is, as a true scholar would call it, fucking amazing. But it's how it's used that makes it, and the visuals it accompanies, truly unnerving. You see, there aren't that many tracks in World of Horror, but depending on the situation, they are either sped up, really slowed down, or something in between, which drastically changes their mood. It gives the game a very dream-like feel. Or nightmare-like, I guess. Like your brain suddenly started malfunctioning.
Thanks, cat.
Take ruined. The game is not perfect though. The randomly generated events are good to keep every playthrough and reused short story feel relatively fresh and exciting, but can sometimes make the game be, as far as I know, undeliberately hilarious. I once investigated an abandoned mansion only to have my character suddenly leave and help a priest carry a bunch of boxes, and then return to the mansion like it was nothing. What's that? A masked killer has murdered several of my closest friends? Hold on, I'm just gonna go to the gas station and buy some fucking Mountain Dew or something. What we ultimately can learn from Junji Ito and World of Horror is the potentially horrifying but enthralling power of the static image. The Junji Ito collections got movement and color and voice acting and dramatic sound effects and music. Uzumaki's got all that plus live action performances. But none of these things managed to make those adaptations as uncomfortable and scary as World of Horror. Junji Ito is all about the details, but that doesn't mean his work becomes scarier the closer it gets to reality. His work benefits from its limitations, just like Lovecraft's work benefits from its limitations. These pictures will never move, not even an inch. They're not staring back at you, and they will never physically harm you. But somewhere, back in your mind, there is always a small feeling that they might. And the way World of Horror preserves this experience is why it's one of the best, if not the best, Junji Ito adaptation out there. If you stuck around until the end of this video, then thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. And I also really appreciate the people who helped to make this video, especially the lovely, lovely ladies at the YouTube channel Transparency. Thank you so much for reading the script and giving me some really good pointers. I also really like to thank Mia Mulder, who provided this lovely, lovely video camera I'm using right now. And the lovely, lovely person who is behind this absolutely great makeup is sitting right here, and their name is Emma Hagdahl. Say hi!
Hey!
That's Emma. If you want to see more of what I do, then you can find me on Twitch. The channel is called PimIsOnline over there as well. You can find me on Twitter at PimIsOnline, and I'm also on Patreon. Of course, this is my first video, and you haven't seen that much of what I have to offer, so, you know, it's reasonable to wait with donations. But if you want to contribute to the channel already, then you can. And there's also an exclusive video up on Patreon right now that you can watch. So, you know, there are perks and stuff. I'm really terrible at this.
I can talk to you, but I don't think you
Can't you do it instead?
do. Me, in my bra.
I mean, yeah. Why not?
Stick around to the end because you will see.
Stick around until the end and you will see Emma's bra. That's some Patreon exclusive content for you. Check me out on Twitch, check me out on Twitter and Patreon if you want to do that. Links in the description. That's all from me, folks. I'm terrible at this. I will get better. I promise. I don't promise that, actually. I can never promise that, but I will try.